All right, so today's lecture is going to look at the second part of the civil rights movement, which I'm going to call 1964 to 1970. Obviously, the civil rights movement continued past 1970, but past 1970 is not really an area that I've done a lot of research in, so I'm going to stick to what I know. So we'll look at that in this particular video. When we last left off civil rights, we had left at the March on Washington back in March on Washington on August 28th, 1963. You recall that President Kennedy had given support to the idea of civil rights legislation, and so the March on Washington have been a way to remind the president of his promised support on civil rights. Now, Kennedy had died less than 3 months after the March on Washington, and so he was unable to carry through with his promise. And so as far as civil rights legislation goes, that will be done. That will be signed into law by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. The Civil Rights Act basically outlawing segregation in all forms. Not only in schools, but also in public facilities as well. Okay. Now, this is a big victory. Again, it overturns all of the segregation laws in the country with regards to schools, with regards to public facilities, with regards to waiting rooms, bathrooms, water fountains, all the stuff we sort of saw back when we were looking at segregation. What it doesn't touch, though, are problems with voting. Voting was one of the places where there were still some, grandfather laws, literacy tests, et cetera, et cetera. In order to point out that more work that we needed voting laws, okay, at the national level, many of the younger members of civil rights organizations decided to demonstrate the need for voting rights legislation by descending on Mississippi. And this is called Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. The purpose was to register as many African Americans as possible for the 1964 election that was coming up in November. Mississippi had the lowest percentage of registered African American voters. In fact, only 6.7% of eligible African American voters were indeed registered. Eligible. So poll taxes literacy tests, good old-fashioned threats of violence. All of these were used to keep African American voters from registering. In Mississippi, really perfected that. Right. So in the literacy test, this is going to be a mixed group of both white and black students and adults coming down here to Mississippi. Or the registered adults, but also to point out that, again, voting rights legislation is needed to do away with literacy tests and poll taxes and various other sundry ways that people were kept from voting. So there's a lot of voter registration going on in Mississippi by these groups. And a lot of these groups, SNCC is certainly there, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but also the Council on Religion and Races, the National Council of Churches. There were about 100 doctors, nurses who came down to provide medical care, taught health education classes. There was also what were called freedom schools. Sometimes these would be courses in, again, health education, but sometimes they would be courses in, you kind of have to work with the population. So some of these might be political science courses, some of these might be just basic literacy courses. Again, Mississippi really did not do very much to educate its African American population, and so sometimes the freedom schools were really focused on just the very basics of education, but there could also be classes on the African history, which certainly wasn't being taught in Mississippi schools, and so again, there were various educational programs. This all went on for about 10 weeks in Mississippi. Mississippi's local white residents were not particularly thrilled. They resented outsiders. They resented any way to upset the way things have always been. There were drive-by shootings. There were bombings with Molotov cocktails. There is murder. There are arrests. There are beatings. 80 workers are beaten. There are 1,062 people arrested. 37 churches were bombed. 30 homes and businesses owned by African Americans were bombed. The most famous criminal case to come out of this is, of course, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. These three men went missing very early on, June 21st. Cheney worked for CORE. Schwerner also worked for CORE. Goodman was a volunteer from New York. They were picked up by a deputy sheriff who was also a member of the Klan. They were held until late at night. When they were released, they were ambushed by Klansmen, and all three of them were murdered. Goodman and Schwerner were immediately killed. Cheney was chased, caught by the Klansmen, beaten severely, and then killed. Eventually, the FBI became involved. Major newspapers came down looking for these guys. Became a big story. Locals believed that it was a hoax, that the men had faked their disappearance. But while looking for eight other African Americans who had been missing for quite some time were found, including a 14-year-old member of CORE named Herbert Orsby. Of the eight found, five of them were never identified. The other two were also college students. These guys are found on August 4th. Okay, their bodies were found in an earthen dam. There was mixed reaction particularly from SNCC about this whole issue. As SNCC pointed out, African Americans in Mississippi went missing all the time. The FBI never came down there looking for them. The Washington Post and the New York Times never sent newspaper reporters down there looking for them. But all of a sudden, a couple of white guys from New York go missing, and all of a sudden, J. Edgar Hoover himself, the head of the FBI, comes to Mississippi. The Washington Post shows up, ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, the New York Times. So SNCC, there was definitely some embitterment on the part, particularly of SNCC, that nobody ever looked for African Americans who went missing in Mississippi. That certainly never made the news, but again, a couple of white guys go missing, and the entire resources of the federal government and major media outlets are showing up. So this led to some bitterness, and in fact, SNCC, within 2 years, SNCC would actually purge all of its white members and become strictly an organization for African Americans. Uh, 19 men were eventually arrested for the murders of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. 7 were convicted, but none of them served more than 6 years. But seeing the brutality with which just registering people to vote, the way that Mississippi whites cracked down on this, eventually did lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Which outlawed poll taxes, the literacy test, and all other methods to disenfranchise people, and required that states with a history of discrimination had to have their elections carefully watched by the Justice Department. And this was pretty much the rule of the land up until not that long ago, when the Supreme Court gutted most of the Voting Rights Act because racism no longer exists in America, was basically what the Supreme Court says. Not sure what planet those people were living on. So there's been really a push, especially with the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Act, to put some of the voting rights protections back into place in order to make elections as fair as possible in all states. The other thing, the second half of the civil rights movement, or the late 60s version, is that it wasn't all about segregation. As the civil rights movement began moving north, civil rights leaders began to discover that segregation was not really the problem up north. People, African Americans in Chicago and in New York, they could vote. That wasn't the problem. The problem up there in the north for African Americans were problems of ghettos, limited economic opportunities, and police brutality. That was what the northern and western civil rights movement was going to have to deal with. And a lot of, particularly the older civil rights groups, Dr. King and others, it took them a while to adjust their message to problems that were much more deeply rooted than segregation and voting rights. And in fact, we'll see Dr. King, particularly in the last 2 years of his life, really come down very hard on the American economic system. One of his last books, and I want to make sure I get this. I forget what it's called. But you'll recall that when Dr. King was assassinated, he was in Memphis to stand with garbage men who had gone on strike. What was shaping up as the Poor People's Campaign. And so one of his last published works, make sure I get the name right. The book that was published by King shortly before he began his last campaign, Where Do We Go From Here, was about, he felt that the only way to fix America's racial issues was to fix its economic issues. He became very outspoken about how much money was being pissed away in the Vietnam War. And then he lost a lot of allies in the Johnson administration for doing so. So again, it's a much more difficult thing to deal with. And it took a while for Dr. King to find his footing, as well as for some of the older groups like CORE, SLC, NAACP, and so on. These problems here led to the mid-60s riots. Basically, starting in the summer of 1965 and pretty much continuing throughout 1966 and 67, Riots broke out in Los Angeles, Atlanta, San Francisco, Oakland, Baltimore, Seattle, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Newark, Chicago, Brooklyn, Harlem, the Bronx, and Detroit. The one in Watts started because the police were attempting to arrest an African-American man who they suspected was drunk driving. And the gentleman's mother came down, and there was some kind of scuffle, and it's a lot of he said, she said, but the rumor that went out is that the cops had hit the mother, right? This African-American mother, who probably would have been in her 40s or 50s, maybe older. That sparked off several days of rioting in Watts. 6 days of riots, 34 people killed, and about $30 million in damaged property. And these riots went on again through the summer of '66, the summer of '67. Here's Detroit. That problem with police brutality also leading to the formation of the Black Panthers. You know, and the Panthers originally wanted white police to stay out of their neighborhoods. They would police their own neighborhoods. They didn't need white police coming down and doing it for them. They also set up free breakfast programs for poor children living in the ghetto. So you would have these Black Panthers serving breakfast to school children in the morning. Other attempts to fill in for social services that weren't being provided by the city. But the Panthers were also letting people know they were not going to be victims of police brutality. This picture is taken in California, and this was legal. It was legal in California to carry what were called long rifles until the Black Panthers started doing it. And then the California Congress, at the urging of Governor Ronald Reagan, made this carrying of long rifles very illegal. But clearly, the Panthers had a problem with the police. There's a lot of shootouts, particularly between the Oakland chapter and the Oakland police. I wish I knew more about Black Panther history. It is one of the weaker areas. But one thing the Panthers were adamant about was that they were not going to just lie down for police brutality, that those days were over. And that led to a lot of conflict, as you can imagine. Other goals, in addition to stopping police brutality, some economic help would be nice. Again, the ghettos were, high rates of unemployment, high rates of drug traffic, which is another thing that the Panthers initially tried to do, was drive out the drug traffic from the ghettos. So getting some economic opportunity, doing something about the substandard housing that made up the ghettos, and doing something about police brutality. These are the goals that we see for the Northern civil rights movement. The riots led to a phenomena called white flight. As the riots got worse and worse, the white middle class began to flee the cities for the suburbs. And this made the problems worse because the tax base was also fleeing as well. And as more and more middle class people fled the cities, cities had less and less money to deal with more and more problems. And so we see places like Detroit, Newark, that are really just hollowed out. And we're still living with that today as these areas it's difficult for them to attract middle class. It's difficult for them to attract any type of industrial work, anything that provides solids for the middle class jobs. In Detroit, there was not only white flight, Detroit was one of the few cities in the United States, at least in the north, that had a sizable middle class due to the auto industry. And they also decided they did not want to stick around for the inner city summer riots. And so you saw both a white and black flight fleeing Detroit as problems became worse and worse. And again, that's taking the tax base, which is taking the city's coffers to deal with the problems it has, you know. And again, Detroit is still recovering. You know, there are parts of Detroit, you know, in the last 20 years where the city of Detroit has basically said, if you live past this point, there's no more city services. Okay, move in closer to the city or you're on your own. Okay, for things like garbage pickup and other things like that. So again, Detroit has really had to contract, modern Detroit, its borders in order to provide any services. And a lot of it has had to do with that tax base that started fleeing in the 60s and in the 70s. Of course, 1968 sees the assassination of Dr. King while he's in Memphis, attempting to help out garbage men who were on strike. By that point, the civil rights movement had badly fractured. There were the older groups that were still trying to find some way to work within the system. And then there were younger groups who had totally decided they would not work with white people at all. SNCC had done this, the Black Panthers, the entire Black Power movement was largely about disengaging with white society. And this was not a new idea. Marcus Garvey, way back in the 20s, had the idea that African Americans should either leave the United States for some other parts of the world or try to have their own areas within the United States that were strictly theirs and theirs alone, which is what some of the Black Power adherents wanted. Also, the groups were coming undone by rivalries within and without. We now know that Fred Hampton, a very charismatic leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, was essentially murdered by Chicago police. There was an insider. The Chicago police had planted an insider who slipped Fred Hampton a powerful sedative And when the police raided the apartment, Hampton never woke up, and there was an enormous gun battle. Hampton never woke up. The police simply walked up to Hampton's bed and shot him twice in the head. He never woke up. And that was not known until years later when the informant, the inside man, gave affidavits about that, and then committed suicide by walking out onto the highway and getting hit by several vehicles. So between the FBI illegally inserting itself, operation called COINTELPRO, between those guys and various police departments, planting rumors to try to get civil rights leaders, particularly Black Panthers, to turn against each other. And then the drugs. Some of the Black Panthers, in order to get more money, took over the drug trade. They had chased all the drug dealers out and then simply took it over themselves. Essentially, by the FBI's own standards, the civil rights movement was basically dead by 1970. Between the FBI and local police and their own rivalries within and without, the civil rights movement had really burned itself out. Had the cops kept their hands to themselves, whether or not that still would have happened, purely an academic question. But we stop at 1970 because that's basically where the FBI called off their dogs and said enough was enough. All right, so that is where we will stop. And I'm not sure what the next video will be about, but I'm sure it will be very interesting. All righty then. Stop this, and I'll see you in the next video.